Welcome. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I hope everyone had a great summer. We are thrilled to welcome you tonight for this special speaker and to hear Larry Sonsini, who is truly, I love this, a Silicon Valley legend. For those of you who don't know who Larry Sonsini is, he's helped launch some of the most profitable and innovative companies in the digital age. From Apple's IPO in 1980 to Netscape, Google, Sun Microsoft Systems, and Tesla. Larry is an internationally renowned lawyer in the areas of corporate law, corporate governance, securities, and mergers and acquisitions. He's also very civically involved in many organizations, and we are excited to hear his thoughts about this inflection point that we've reached today, and about Silicon Valley, where we are, its leadership, and we're really excited to hear what he has to share with us. I also wanted to say a big thank you to Diane Morris, who is here with us, with her dad, who I understand is one of Larry's close friends. And thank you, Diane, for supporting this opportunity for us to hear so many wonderful speakers from the Bay Area and from also outside. And also a warm welcome to all of our Society of Fellow members. It was nice to reconnect with all of you. And if you're not a Society of Fellow member, I would love to tell you more about the membership program. We have a really active roster of engaging programs planned throughout the Bay Area, also in LA and Seattle this year. And I'd love to tell you more about the work we do and how it supports the mission of the Aspen Institute. So without further ado, please welcome Larry Sonsini.
Thank you, Stacy and Diane. It's great to be here, and thank you all for joining in. I'm going to talk a bit about Silicon Valley tonight, and I'd like to not only talk about its history a little bit, to put it in perspective, but also to comment on its recipe, because the Valley really has become more than a place. It has become a concept that has been very difficult to emulate or to repeat in other communities or other countries. I have visited and lectured about this, and people often ask, what is the recipe? Why is it working? Why is it expanding? And I think it's important for all of us, particularly because it's here, to appreciate the ingredients. And then I'd like to also comment upon some of the challenges, because we are in a fascinating age of technology. We are experiencing exponential growth. Technology is becoming obsolete in 6 to 12 months. And many of our institutions, our laws, our regulations, our other constituencies are having a hard time keeping up. And as a result, we're experiencing a lot of disruption and dependency, and I thought I'd give you a perspective on that from inside the park. So as I say, the Valley has been obviously very successful. We know what's happened. We have more than 10,000 companies that are headquartered here. It has been reported, quite frankly, that we had over 40,000 startups in 2018, most of them here in the expanded Valley. So the growth has become significant. We probably employ close to 2 million people here, but there are 12 million people throughout the United States employed directly in technology. And when you think about the size of the workforce, that is an incredibly small percentage. But yet look at the dependency and disruption that's going on. And so there is a disconnect there that we have to appreciate and talk about, because technology is commoditizing industries and it is causing displacement. And obviously we've created a lot of value. My last look, Silicon Valley companies that are publicly traded have a market capitalization over $2 trillion. So we are talking about significant impact. The fact is that we have to understand the environment and the ecosystem we're in. We live in a world that is digital, mobile, virtual, personal, and global as a result of this technology. Obviously, you know it's digital in that all physical content, every physical process, all analog content is and will become digital and digitized. We have digitized speech, photography, music, payment for goods, ride sharing, home sharing, who we date, how we buy and how we are entertained, and it's not done. In addition to the digitization of it all, we have become very mobile and very, very much connected. And that, of course, is due to the growth of the internet, which is really more than a connectivity device, a communication device. I remember in the very beginning when I was dealing with companies like Netscape, we thought it would be a product, but it really isn't a product. It is basically a platform, a service, and it's ubiquitous. Our world is also becoming virtual. You know that. By that I mean we are enabling lifelike realities. Technology is making geography, and it's also making time almost irrelevant. And that is disturbing, and it's yet empowering. Certainly the world is more personal, and this is the challenge, a big challenge. While we are more in control of what we can do, we can select the way we obtain or convey information. We can even select relationships differently. We can even communicate with relationships differently. But there's a cost and a price to that, which I'm going to comment on, that we have to deal with. And obviously, we are living in a global economy, notwithstanding world politics, because all of this technology doesn't really live within borders. It transcends borders. There's no such thing as geography limitation. And it's affecting economic decisions, have major impact on other nations' policies and our personal lives. So a global world. But before I get into the ingredients of the recipe, let's talk a little bit about history here, because it's really important that we put in perspective how this all came together and why it's unique. And why is it still growing? I'm often asked, and have been asked, when is the Valley going to slow down? When is technology going to slow down? And believe me, in my judgment, other than exogenous events, it's not going to slow down because it's really exponential and it's really conceptual. And we have to appreciate that. But I want to go back and talk about how attitudes have changed, because attitudinal dimensions are influencing where we're going with technology. If we go back to the 1950s, the book, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, depicted our economy. We would all go to work for a very large corporation. We would spend our entire careers there, and we would basically be insulated from business risk. And there was a period of time, as we got into the 60s and early 70s, that people doubted whether we would ever see the great entrepreneurs again. You know, the John Rockefellers, the Henry Fords, the Howard Hugheses, the Bill Hewletts, and David Packards. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, because we have seen great entrepreneurs from William Shockley to Bob Noyce, and more recently Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and others. I think it's safe to say that the ecosystem and entrepreneurship is a major part of our country's greatest economic competitive advantage. If you really step back and look at what's going on economically and looking at growth, this technology engine is really catapulting the U.S., and I think we really are very far ahead when it comes to commercialization of technology, and it's gotten more distant from other nations, and it's causing some interesting political issues. So I think this history is important. I think it's also important to understand how business attitudes changed. Business, before we really got this recipe going, tended to be highly skeptical of technology in early stage companies. Entrepreneurs were considered odd and nerdy. Startup businesses were considered too risky. Venture capital, the concept of investing in these risk companies, was viewed too illiquid, too volatile. And in addition, it was really hard to start these companies. It was hard to recruit talent, customers were hard to come by, and suppliers demanded cash. And of course, there was no cash, and you couldn't get a bank line of credit because you didn't have a cash flow to pay interest, and you had no assets to lend against because the assets went home every night. So a problem. And to address these attitudes, the early leaders in the Valley, and I'm fortunate to say that our law firm started alongside these leaders and were part of the recipe, had to develop a unique model. And I want to comment on that model because it's very much alive today. What we were doing back in the late 60s and early 70s when the Valley got its name is being replicated every day. It hasn't changed that much. As a matter of fact, many of the term sheets for the financing of these startup companies are exactly the same they were 40, 50 years ago. It's really interesting. The legal fees have gotten lower, though. But the model is unique, and it has the following elements. Contrary to the principles of the man in the gray flannel suit, the entrepreneur would quit his job, turn over his ideas and technology to a new corporation, take a very low salary, and not have a guarantee of employment or any control over the corporate entity. Now, why would he do that? And it was a couple of reasons. Obviously, the entrepreneur would get founder stock, and it would be stock in the corporation in exchange for his ideas, his invention, his innovation, which is turned over to the corporation. But there was a hook into that. This stock was subject to vesting based upon continued employment. In other words, if the entrepreneur quit the job or was fired, the unvested stock would go back to the company, but not his intellectual property, not his idea. It would stay with the company. So a very, very risk proposition. The other reason was the venture capitalists. The venture capitalists would invest all the necessary cash, as you know, to fund and organize the company, but also would invest more than money. Venture capitalists in the beginning provided management support, helped recruit people. So it was a very interesting model. And basically, it was a relationship of trust. There were no guarantees, there were no contracts promising any upside. The basis of trust was in the motivations of each party. The entrepreneur knew that he needed venture capital. The venture capital knew he needed the entrepreneur. There were no contracts, and everybody was at risk. So risk is a very key part of the model. And those were the basic principles. And this model, as I say, is still used today. And for many years, the US was the only country in the world to truly embrace it as a fundamental business practice. This is a very foreign concept. When I go to Europe, or even when I visit our offices in China, this concept is very foreign. It's viewed as very risk, and we'll see why in a moment. I was fortunate. Our law firm grew up with the industry, and we became the third partner on this program and this model. We partnered with the entrepreneur and the venture capitalist and also shared in the risk. So one may ask, why hasn't this model been repeated in other cultures, in other communities or other countries? It really has been slow to develop. Frankly, I think that the one country that has done a better job than anybody else happens to be China. And isn't it interesting that that country, which is basically a communist-based governance system, has adopted elements of this model, which is highly capitalistic. And I want to talk about that because I think it goes to show you the power of what's happening in alternative systems and societies. So, in my mind, the recipe is really important. And there are 7 key ingredients. And I believe that if any one ingredient is off kilter or out of balance, the whole thing doesn't work. Now, obviously, the first element, the first ingredient is an entrepreneurial culture. Now, what does that mean? Well, an entrepreneurial culture in technology is one that is based on merit. It's a meritocracy. Race, gender, personality, where you went to school, pedigree, how you dress, quite frankly, has been consistently irrelevant. Very important thing. It is success-oriented. It's okay to make money. Importantly, very importantly, failure is not a stigma. It's just an experience. And think of other nations where that isn't the case. You know, Japan tried to emulate this whole culture, but failure is treated differently. And where failure is a stigma, you stifle innovation, you stifle risk. And most importantly, diversity is crucial. Diversity is very key. I had one venture capitalist tell me that, the Valley was built on ICs, and I immediately thought integrated circuits, right, semiconductors. And he says, no, it's Indians and Chinese. And there's a lot of truth to that. Someone once told me that there are over 60 languages spoken in the Valley. Diversity is very, very important. And we must recognize and deal with these ingredients. If we restrict freedom of thought, we deny diversity, and we will slow innovation. We must allow opportunity. Quite frankly, we need a sound immigration policy because this is all part of the culture. And we need to focus on blind meritocracy and be sure that we not fall into categorizing people or shutting walls or building walls because innovation depends on this very careful fluid element. And I think that ingredient is still well intact, but we've had some headwinds, and I think we've got to improve on that. The second ingredient, and this is very, very important, is the role of the university. Frankly, where you don't have major universities, the Silicon Valley recipe has not been able to grow. Without the location of the universities, and it's very important, and the classic example goes back to the late 1960s. Wallace Stirling, who was president, and Fred Terman, who was the provost at Stanford, really got the idea that we really need to attract our engineers to stay here in Palo Alto. How are we going to do this? How are we going to keep them here? And they got the concept in mind that we're going to encourage our students to be entrepreneurial. In fact, two of his students were Bill Hewlett and David Packard. And Fred, frankly, was an investor. And he was a director at HP for many, many, many years. When you look at our universities in our area, Stanford, Berkeley, UCSF, Santa Clara, San Jose State, and you look at their policies and compare them to other universities, you'll see a marked difference, although many other universities are trying to adopt these policies. I was down in Southern California last year meeting with some of the presidents of the major universities down there, and they're asking, what are those policies? Well, first of all, our universities allow the commercialization of intellectual property on a seamless and inexpensive basis. Liberal licensing policies, the promotion of advanced teaching, allowing graduate students to commercialize their dreams. When Larry Page and Sergey Brin came to see me in 1998 as graduate students at Stanford, their whole concept of search, and by the way, I asked them, what is search? But it was all based on algorithms that they really defined and created as graduate students. And we did not have a problem with Stanford University saying, hey, that's ours. It was go do it. Very important attitude. And our universities in our area are going a step further. They're even incubating startup entrepreneurs. So if you go to Berkeley, they have 3 or 4 incubators where students take time to think about business plans and invent and start companies. And as a matter of fact, the University of California, like Stanford, sponsors a venture capital arm that is aimed at supporting these entrepreneurial efforts at that early stage. Where this doesn't exist, it's very hard. I had a speech I gave a few years ago at Cambridge, and Cambridge says, we have as good a technology as Stanford or Berkeley and the other schools. And I said, but what about your commercialization of it? What about letting go of it? What about letting the students take it? And then they just stared at me and said, what do you mean? It's ours. It belongs to Cambridge. So be it. But our universities are challenged today. Now here's a headwind here. The cost of education is growing. Student debt is very high. The economic business models of many of our universities are highly challenged. It's very difficult to raise tuitions because we're driving students away from the college experience. We have seen the decline of liberal arts as an institution as technology has forced more emphasis on science and engineering and math and whatnot. We need to support our universities differently. And it's very critical that we support them and we give them the room they need to maintain top faculty, to maintain research, but also to maintain this culture of allowing commercialization of innovation at the very early stage of graduate schools. The third element, the third ingredient, very important, is the access to capital. Obviously, without capital, the model doesn't work. And we've been fortunate here to really be the center of the growth of venture capital. It's important to recognize, however, that without a very liquid, transparent, stable, and well-regulated public marketplace, you would not have risk capital. And one of the great assets in the United States is the liquidity and stability of its capital markets. If you look around the world and you look for other markets, they don't compare. They're trying. I mean, Hong Kong's doing a pretty good job, but stop and think about Eastern Bloc countries and others. And our capital markets are based on some very fine principles that go back to 1933, 1934. That's when we put in the legislation about our federal security laws. And those laws were brilliant. As one judge characterized them, he said these laws are based on the principle that sunshine is the best disinfectant and electric light is the best policeman. And that's right. It's all about disclosure. It's all about transparency. It's all about eliminating as best we can fraud. And because you have liquid markets, you're willing to invest risk capital because that's your exit. And that is the heart of the model. The venture capitalists and other investors are willing to invest in these high-risky businesses with the view that if they're successful, I have an exit strategy. And that's that U.S. capital market. So it's very, very important that we really understand the significance of that and really understand the challenges. Now, capital has really changed in the Valley. I think one of the greatest aspects of the growth that we've experienced in the last 15 years is we have more diverse capital here than ever before. You know, there's close to $400 billion that has been put into the system, but the system is very diverse. Venture capital is now only a small slice of it. You have micro VCs, you have angel investors, you have family offices. You've got the world of private equity now coming into technology. You've got major institutions like Fidelity, Vanguard, Goldman Sachs coming into technology. And now you have sovereign wealth funds, Singapore, some of the major companies in China. The capital is very diverse, very stable, very bold, and that is fueling the change. But I think other things are happening that we got to be mindful of. There are some headwinds. So for example, I talked about the importance of the liquidity of our capital markets. But do you know that in the last 15 years, the number of U.S. public companies has declined by 50%? A decline of 50%. Companies are staying private longer. And what's happening is value returns are being experienced more in the private market than in the public market. The public market is being characterized by index funds that are passive investors or large dominant public companies. And stock ownership in the United States has really shifted more and more to institutional ownership. Retail ownership has almost disappeared. I remember when I was doing early IPOs, we used to argue how much of it is going to be retail, individuals, you and me. And we would always say maybe 25, 30%. Back in the days when some of our investment banking firms, I saw George Montgomery here back in our Hambrick and Quist days, and it was that's what we thought. But today, the retail component is very, very small. So we got to continue to monitor our capital markets. We got to give access to all of us. We got to be sure that there isn't a gap of those that get the share and those that don't. We got to keep this market liquid and transparent. And we have to understand why companies are staying private longer. Certainly the Securities and Exchange Commission is all over this. I'm advising the Commission on some of these issues, and we have to address them. The fourth key element is the role of established corporations, another critical ingredient. So you got an entrepreneurial culture, you've got the universities, you got capital. But you need corporations as breeding ground for management and for an entrepreneurship. And in the early days, we had companies like Fairchild Semiconductor, Watkins Johnson, Hewlett-Packard, that were breeding grounds for these entrepreneurs and management style and systems. The team of Bob Noyce that all left Fairchild to start Intel, the famous 8, was all part of that corporate culture. And our corporations are critical. They provide an exit strategy. Many of them do mergers and acquisitions. So if the company can't go public, maybe it gets sold, and that gets the liquidity to the private investor that keeps the cycle going. It's also important to note that many of our large corporations, take Google, take Intel, and others, have their own venture arms. They're major investors today. They are investing in companies. It gives them a window to technology change. Technology is moving so fast, you can't keep up with it. One way to keep a track of it is to invest in these startups. And maybe only 1 in 20 is going to make it, but the 19 others are going to give you a look of what went on and what went wrong, and though it's a very important part. The fifth key element is the entire infrastructure of the industry. This is really important. In order to service these companies that couldn't afford to pay you, you need to adopt a different business model. And quite frankly, you needed the law firms, the accounting firms, the investment banking firms, the real estate development firms, all to change their services. And we did that. We did that. And you can't see that in other communities. I mean, if you go into a community and tell a law firm you have to represent a startup company, and by the way, the fees are as low as they were in 1970, they'd look at you and say, are you kidding? I can't make this work. And so the infrastructure here is really, really developed, very, very sound, very strong. The infrastructure also involves community support. We can put a building up in a matter of months. In some communities, in some countries, you're talking a couple of years to get a permit. Technology can't wait. It can't wait. And so the community support has been terrific. But we have a challenge. The infrastructure is stressed. We all are experiencing the demands of affordable housing, supportive labor, expansion of our educational system for our young children, as well as dealing with the displacement of people and the need for efficient methods of transportation. I mean, we're exhausting the infrastructure. And the valley's not going to go away. It's expanding, and look at the impact it's had in San Francisco. But without this ingredient, you really lose efficiency, and without efficiency, technology will pass you by. The sixth ingredient, which is critical, is the role of government and regulation. The role of government has been critical in the development of the entire technology ecosystem. For example, just going back in history, in 1978, Congressman William Steiger introduced a bill to reduce the tax on capital gains, which was 49%. 49%. It was reduced to 25%, and then later it hit 15% and was backed up. But without that tax policy, people will argue you wouldn't have venture capital because the risk was too high and the reward was maybe too risky. But in addition to tax policy, our federal government has been supportive of innovation compared to other nations. Certain research and development, small business administration, investment support, modification of our security laws to allow the raising of private and capital and public capital easier. But the role of government and government regulation is a very living thing. And one of the problems we have is that technology is moving so fast, government is having a hard time, A, understanding and catching up. And we have a dilemma. We have a dilemma of the separation of what's happening in the public sector and the private sector, what's happening in the political sector and what's happening in the boardroom of these private companies. And some of the discourse you're hearing about government intervention, I believe, is in part to this lack of exposure and the stunning acceleration of technology change. This leads me to the seventh element, and that is the system of laws, justice, and a culture of ethics and integrity. In our developed system of laws and justice, I strongly believe that this element has held many nations back where it is lacking. Without the protection of human rights and the protection of individual rights, entrepreneurialism just will not flourish. It's the other side of the coin of taking risk. Where there is corruption, there will be limited innovation. Where there is a lack of protection of intellectual property, there will be the growth of destructive monopolies. But where there's a system of ethics and integrity, there will be more trust. And without a system of ethics and integrity, you won't have trust. And as I indicated, the model was based on trust because there are no contracts, there are no guarantees. And I think we've got to protect these principles. We must continue to have a developed law. We need to provide access to social justice to more people. We need to instill principles of integrity and ethics and respect in every business plan. A strong system of governance, and I'm going to talk a bit about the challenges of that. Those are the ingredients. That's the recipe. Turn a dial on one of them too far, and you start to destroy the system. Take one element out, it doesn't work. And that's why the Valley is unique, because it's so hard to replicate this elsewhere. It's being done. We're seeing more and more expansion in New York. We've seen it in Boston, although some contraction, but not many other places. And certainly foreign countries really are mystified by this, very mystified by this. I had a delegation from Moscow visit me a couple of years ago and said, we want to talk about developing Silicon Valley in Moscow. And I said, you got a fundamental problem. Your fundamental problem is you got so much corruption. There's the system of ethics, the instability of laws. You can't get this off the ground. And they just stared at me, and I don't think they've ever gotten it off the ground. It's hard. I think that China has addressed it kind of interestingly. They have allowed it to exist in pockets. So if you go to Shanghai, and I have an office in Shanghai, Beijing, and Hong Kong, isn't it interesting? The most dominant technology law firm in the United States, Wilson Sonsini, has for traditionally only 3 offices outside the country, and they're in China. Now that tells you something, because we just follow the technology. We just recently opened up in London because we think Europe is trying, but I ask, where are the universities? Where are the large corporations? Where's the capital? And it's going to take a while. It's going to take a while, and it's challenging. So this is unique what we have here. But I think this recipe, while successful, is taking its toll on things, and I want to comment on that. As we examine the exponential growth of technology, we are now having to recognize the pace of change has been a bit disruptive, and we are becoming dependent on our technologies. Some even fear that technology will lead us to a dystopian future. Certainly, technology is becoming more ingrained in every facet of our life. According to Pew Research, 72% of Americans use some form of social media. In the United States, there are 290 million users of the internet. That's almost 90% of the population. 225 million users of a smartphone, and 235 million users of the mobile internet. Although most say that China's internet penetration is about 50%, its scale means that there are 3 times the number of smartphone users and 11 times the number of mobile payment users in China. So you've got a lot going on over there. And if you stop and think about some of the tariff wars, stop and think about the underlying driver of all of this. Is it really about tariffs, or is it about what's happening in technology, and is the game being played fair? And that is a big issue. But as you know, we are digitizing every industry, as I noted earlier. And look at how the business models have changed compared to the early days. Google, through the internet, has made knowledge ubiquitous and, quite frankly, free. Airbnb rents more rooms but owns no real estate. Facebook, the largest social network, has no content. Amazon and Alibaba in China, they're the largest distributors of retail consumer products. They barely have inventory. Netflix, Apple, Spotify are changing entertainment. And we have completely revolutionized and changed our media and the way we receive our news. You know, an important part of the history of the newspaper industry was the editorial function. The editorial function was kind of a filter to be sure that we got good news as opposed to fake news. But there's no filter in the internet and in social media. There's no filter, and that is part of the problem. And at the same time, our newspapers, their business model doesn't work because people are using that little device to get the news instantly, and there isn't time to put print to paper to deliver, and so on. And so even how we view news is changing, but also it's threatening. So I think that as a result, we see the exponential growth of and the dependency on technology companies and on disruptive technology innovation. Disruptive technologies are constantly changing business models. And I think that this is going to continue. I do not believe that you're going to see a slowdown. And I'll just give you two simple reasons, two technical reasons. One is cloud computing. Now, as you know, what cloud computing is, the cloud is a global network of massive facilities that are filled with computers. And these computers are rented out as a service. So that if you're starting a company up today, you don't have to invest a lot of money in buying a lot of big servers or computers. What you do is you go to the cloud providers, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, and you rent space. And your data is transmitted back and forth to your company, to that space. And that transmission back and forth is the cloud. The information's in the cloud. That has made it very easy to scale companies because you can instantaneously compute and at a lower cost. And that's accelerating cloud services. In fact, I think it's fair to say that the Amazon cloud is said to be the fastest growing business in the history of technology services, and it's growing. The second thing that's happening besides the cloud is machine learning. Cloud computing has enabled computers, as you know, to teach themselves. They now understand speech, they recognize images. Just some examples that you probably have heard of. A smartphone app that can detect skin cancer with the diagnostic skill of a dermatologist. Gene sequencing. I remember when I was backing companies that were doing sequencing of the human genome. The first sequencing took us about 10 years and cost over $1 billion. Now the cost of sequencing DNA is $1,000, and we can do it in a couple days. Very fast, dramatic change. And of course, once you get into sequencing, the data that you're collecting and the predictability of it all is huge, and we'll talk about that. Doctors can diagnose illnesses today by comparing a patient's DNA to large databases of data. The amount of data that is being collected on us is astounding. In fact, one of the largest growth industries is the storage industry, computer storages. We've got so much data, we've got to build machines just to store all that stuff and to have access to it. And we are doing that, and the cloud is helping that. So, quite frankly, the combination of the two is creating artificial intelligence, robotics, and add to it new technologies, nanometrics, quantum computing, the Internet of Things. All of these technology shifts, these platforms of technology are accelerating growth of enterprises and allowing us to explore ideas at the lowest cost. But yet it's here because you need all the elements of the system. Well, what is the impact of all of this? Let's talk about impact a little bit. We talked about dependency, we know that. All of this innovation is also creating, obviously, a lot of change. It's changing the use, quite frankly, in the way we use human labor, human resources. We're transforming our job market. Let's understand that. Technology is commoditizing and replacing many services traditionally filled by human labor, even my industry. You can go online today and get a lease, get a divorce. You don't need to pay a lawyer a big hourly rate, quite frankly. It's commoditizing all industries. And I think we're going through a period of adjustment, of job displacement that is causing a lot of political unrest. And we have to understand that this is not really going to change. And to slow it down, you're going to start slowing down innovation. And is that good for us ultimately, is the debate. We're challenging and changing our educational systems. As I mentioned earlier, liberal arts programs are in decline. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Our high schools and colleges are focusing more on science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM programs. We're even digitizing education today. A large portion of the curriculum of our universities is online, which, and if you stop and think about it, is going to give education more access to more people at a lower cost, and probably as efficiently. History, however, shows that we've adjusted with technology. And I've looked back and seen some of the change. You know, if you go back even to the 1900s, remember 41% of us all worked in agriculture. By the year 2000, only 2%. Manufacturing jobs were over 30% of the workforce at the end of World War II. Today, manufacturing jobs are around 10%. So we have adjusted in the past, and we will adjust again. But I think the speed of change and the quantum of disruption is daunting. And it is really affecting our enterprises. And one I'd like to comment upon is what's happening to the U.S. corporation today. Because if you read, and you do read the news, there's a lot going on about the purpose of a U.S. corporation. Let me go back. In 1970, there was an essay published by Milton Friedman, the economist. It was a very important essay. It was in the New York Times. And he said there is only one social responsibility of business: to engage in activities designed to increase profits and make money for shareholders. In other words, the purpose of the U.S. corporation was only to make money for shareholders. This became known as the shareholder primacy standard. And in the legal business, when you talk about fiduciary duties of CEOs or fiduciary duties of directors, and many of you are directors of companies, you know that your fiduciary duty is to enhance shareholder value. Well, let's flash forward to January 2019. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, one of the largest asset managers in the world, issued a letter to corporate CEOs in America. He said society is increasingly looking to corporations, both public and private, to address pressing social and economic issues ranging from climate change to gender and racial inequality, rather than making profits. His letter implies that a corporation's purpose is not the sole pursuit of profits. He says that having a social purpose and being accountable to other stakeholders, employees, customers, the community, universities, and not just shareholders, will help achieve profits in the long term. The Business Roundtable, which is a group consisting of chief executive officers of leading American corporations, meet informally to consider public policy issues. About 2 months ago, they came out with a pronouncement. The Business Roundtable statement, which is 300 words long, the word shareholders isn't mentioned until about word 250. The report refers to creating value for customers, investing in employees, fostering diversity and inclusion, dealing fairly and ethically with suppliers, supporting the communities in which we work, and protecting the environment. In fact, a recent survey by Deloitte asked millennial workers what the primary purpose of business should be in the United States. 63% more said improving society rather than making money. But the shareholder privacy standard is now under attack. Stakeholders, such as employees, communities, are pushing companies to wade into social and political issues. Regulators, investors, academics, and politicians are now questioning not only the purpose of the U.S. corporation, but whether or not we ought to shift to a stakeholder constituency standard rather than a shareholder standard. This is leading to a shift in tone. And corporations now are being challenged to make a contribution. And of course, when you start challenging the purpose of a U.S. corporation, you now naturally lead into challenging capitalism. You know, a Harvard Business School professor began pushing what he called shared value capitalism. Some talk about conscious capitalism. Others talk about compassionate capitalism. And it is interesting that a 2016 Harvard study found that 50% of U.S. respondents between the ages of 18 and 29 did not favor a capitalistic system. So things are changing, and it's impacting these entities. It's impacting how we govern, and I think that it goes to show you of the magnitude of the challenge. Lastly, before I conclude, I want to comment about our laws, because you also read a lot in the paper about our antitrust laws and discussions about busting up technology companies and breaking them up as a way to slow down this disruption. But the problem is, these laws were not designed for these kind of problems. The antitrust laws were designed to go after companies that put out high consumer prices. It's all about too much cost to the consumer. But these technologies today don't have prices. They're free. And so the model of our legislation to apply to this exponential change is somewhat out of whack. And that is the debate that we have. And as you know, the United States Justice Department, as well as the 50 states attorney generals, are now open investigations of all these tech companies regarding monopolies and antitrust laws. And my problem is, without taking a position, because I represent some of these companies, so you did not hear anything, is that we've got to be careful about the problem we're defining. And we've got to be careful about what we're really trying to solve. Technology is with us, it's disruptive, but it's also a good thing. We're going to improve society if we get our act together. We're going to live better, we're going to have more opportunity, but we're going through this period where there's a gap between innovation penetration and culture, rules, and regulations catching up. Thank you very much. I think I've run out of time.
Some Q&A, and there's mics right in the ceiling, so we just...
Hi, I'm Tassie. I have the privilege of working with Guy Kawasaki just out of college in Silicon Valley, but I'm now a surgeon at UCSF. So my question has more to do with healthcare and technology. As more and more people are willingly giving their healthcare information and even their DNA sequencing to some of these startup companies, I'm curious what your thoughts are about HIPAA and the protection of patient identification. As it really conflicts with machine learning, and machine learning is based on more and more data to make us more accurate as physicians in diagnosing problems. And so how you see that tension in the valley, but still protecting the individual.
Yeah, that is a great tension. There's no doubt about it that we would have better drug efficacy, better diagnosis, and better prognosis if we had more data. Billions of dollars are spent on drug research. Most of the drugs that are discovered are thrown away because the efficacy applied to a broad population is too risky. But if you have enough data to really understand the efficacy as the individuals, a lot of those drugs would work. So clearly, data is important, and we've got to get access to it. But we don't have the system to deal with the privacy issue. We need people to turn over their medical records anonymously. We need to see a life cycle of disease. And then we need to sequence it. And we can do it. We can do it. And then we take this data and we can develop predictive algorithms. I think it's coming. It's not there. The privacy issue is where we're lagging.
You have a legacy as also a governance quant. So how do you how do you speak to your clients about being in a position where, looking back, there wasn't a lot of governance as it relates to data, the use of data, and it's now spun up in this country as a fear of technology. So what do you do today?
Now, that's a great question. I really do think that we have to revise our governance system. I think that there's a correlation between good governance in a corporation and developing value. And the reason is that our corporations are affecting too many of our constituencies. You know, technology in the early days, the 70s was semiconductors, the 80s were computers and software, the 90s were life sciences. We weren't affecting directly consumers. We were selling business to business. They used to call B2B business, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now today, you don't hear B2B too much. You hear B2C, business to consumer. And so now when we're dealing with consumers, we need a different governance model. We need to focus on impact on society. We need to focus on impact on the environment. You know, I strongly believe in capitalism. I think it's the greatest system from the world I come from, technology. I don't see why a corporation paying attention to these issues, where it's correlated to value, cannot work. And I think that's where it has to go.
You spoke about the 7 critical elements required to develop and maintain Silicon Valley, and then you ended with a potential revolution for adding social and personal responsibility. If the next would-be Silicon Valley comes to you, says we want to emulate or actually surpass Silicon Valley, and specifically, how can we use this 8th critical element, the adding of social and personal responsibility to that as a competitive advantage against our competitors?
That's a great question, and I don't have that answer. Because the problem with my governance proposition is the ability to measure success. So for example, under the shareholder primacy standard, we can judge a CEO's performance by looking at the growth of revenue and profit. Hey, you're losing money, we're going to change it. But when you say now that your purpose, in addition to making money, is social impact, doing social good, working for the environment, improving society, how do you measure that? How do you know the CEO is successful? And I worry about lack of measurements, because with lack of measurement, you have lack of accountability. And with lack of accountability, you foster environments for not good things. I think that's our challenge. And I think what we have to do is we have to have common ground. We can't solve this by changing our antitrust laws. I think we need to get in a room, quite frankly, with all the constituencies, and we gotta say, we gotta talk about this. We gotta define this problem. So I worry about the governance model that I see coming and that I think could work. But what I'm very afraid of is I don't know how to measure the success of it. And I fear that in any system of governance where you can't measure success, you open up the problem of fraud, misdeeds, and lack of accountability. So we got a challenge. This is not an easy problem.
Oh, sorry, hang on a second. I just want to let Russ talk.
Me?
Yeah, please, sorry.
Good evening. A quick question. Can you comment on the subject of big data and politics? And I'm also curious if you hear rumblings of any entrepreneurs trying to get into the space with ideas about how to counter and identify some of the bad actors out there?
You know, I don't see much of that except in the area of cybersecurity. I think that one of the big threats is the cybersecurity threat. It's the other side of the coin of the problem of privacy. One of the side effects of all of this technology is that you can hack any system at any time. We are constantly having to play defense in this business. And I think that big data is going to be very important. But as we get more data, our cyber systems become under more stress. And there's different ways of hacking and manipulating. I think that is a big challenge. I really do. I think that and privacy, I think it's cybersecurity and privacy and data collection, coupled with this stressful governance model, those are the 3 big question marks out there for me. And I do not think the politicians in Washington fully understand this, or perhaps they understand it, but they got other issues. And it worries me when I look at political debate, and we have debates, and we talk about things, very important things, affordable health care, diversity. But we're not talking about these real threats. this disruption. And privacy is really critical because no one should deny anybody the right of an opinion, nor deny them the right to have that opinion published on a website. But what you have to worry about is that platform, Facebook, deciding to prioritize and choose which goes first and which goes last. That's a judgment on an opinion that affects us all because we're not reading newspapers, or if we are, we don't have the filter. There's the challenge. And I think this challenge is confusing us, that we've got to stop technology. It's going to take us to a dystopian place. No, we just have to adjust. We just have to adjust, and we can't.
We'll have time for two more.
Just one question over here.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so let's do you and then, so Ethan?
Yes.
Okay. We start right here.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's interesting to me that unemployment's below 4%, and it's been heading down for a long time, even as talk about this job destruction goes on. And so that suggests to me something else. It's a concern about perhaps a loss of good paying jobs, but jobs that are dependable, jobs with meaning. Now, you see a lot of young companies coming through that we won't see for 5 years. That's a market opportunity. Is anybody addressing that?
You know, your question on jobs is excellent. I think it all depends on how you define the equation and the denominator. So what is the job market? Is it those that are applying, or is it those that have decided to just quit and not apply? And I think that that issue is something that these young companies can't really address and aren't addressing. The fact of the matter is, it does not take a lot of human labor to innovate in the early stages. And so I think that we will probably displace faster than we replace. But I think your point is well taken. I think that we're just changing the economy to more of a service economy. And I think that we're going to have to educate to it. But I really don't have that answer. It's a dilemma. It's a good point.
And with Ethan?
Great. Thank you for the talk, by the way. I want to ask your opinion on AI in China, because you talked about many scenarios where our diverse, multicultural Silicon Valley is ahead in many areas. But I look at AI, and if you believe the press, China is ahead and investing in it from a government level and likely to stay ahead. So what is your view on that very important technology that might have big implications in China?
We got to do more of it. That's my view. I think China is taking government sponsorship to another level. You know, we represent a lot of Chinese companies. In fact, China is very unique. The largest semiconductor company in China at one time hired Wilson Sonsini to represent it. It was a conscious decision by the PRC. They controlled the company. And they did it because they wanted to learn the recipe. So they have had a pretty good look. And the US government allowed us to go in. We got licensed, and we represented that China company. And I've got to see how they operate. And they allow entrepreneurialism to a point. They allow the Alibabas to grow. They allow some foreign investment. Look at what Ma Sasan of SoftBank has put into China. He's the largest shareholder in Alibaba. And what they've decided to do is focus all this on AI, where they are sponsoring entrepreneurialism. They're putting up the capital. They're putting up the facilities. And they truly believe that with AI, they can gather data and manipulate it faster than any other technology out there, and I happen to think they're right. I think that we got to get behind that. I think that we have to do more of that. I think we've got the capital, we've got the entrepreneurs, we've got the system. I just think we got to have a little more support for it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all for coming. I was just thinking about how many people ask, like, what the impact, what does the Aspen Institute actually do? And many of the challenges that Larry outlined are areas that we're working really hard on, hopefully to solve. For example, our Business and Society program, the head of that program director, Judy Samuelson, worked closely with Jamie Dimon to craft the revised statement about putting stakeholders first instead of just the shareholders. So that's just one example, and I encourage you to check out our website to see we have future of work policy issues, a big cybersecurity, tech policy, so hopefully we'll help solve some of these issues that you outlined. And so with that, I want to thank Diane, and please save the date of November 19th where we can reconvene, and the topic will be the future of pop culture. And we are bringing Ted Sarandos, who is the Chief Content Officer of Netflix, and he'll be interviewed by Derek Thompson from The Atlantic. And so for all you Orange is the New Black and Black Mirror and The Crown fans, please come, because he has certainly been behind sort of how we view and consume content today. So thank you and have a good night.
So I